Welcome to Half Hour of Heterodoxy, conversations with scholars and authors, ideas from diverse viewpoints and perspectives.
Welcome to Half Hour of Heterodoxy. My name is Cory Clark. I am the Director of Academic Engagement for Heterodox Academy, and I will occasionally be hosting episodes alongside our regular host, Chris Martin. Michael Roth is my guest today. Michael is a historian, the president of Wesleyan University, and the author of the book Safe Enough Spaces, A Pragmatist's Approach to Inclusion, Free Speech, and Political Correctness on College Campuses. Heterodox Academy held its first ever book club a few weeks back, and we chose to read Safe Enough Spaces as our first book. And we had a lively debate about it, lively discussion, not a lot of debate. Now we have Michael here to discuss the book, and we will include a couple questions from our book club participants in this episode as well. So, hi, Michael. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
The title of your book is Safe Enough Spaces. So perhaps the obvious question to start with is, what do you mean by spaces that are safe enough?
Well, it was somewhat of a joke title when I came up with it with the help of my wife, who's a professor here at Wesleyan also. In the 50s, the psychoanalysts had this idea of the good enough mother, and which evolved into the good enough parent when I guess they realized that fathers parent too, or at least they're supposed to. And so the good enough parent was the parent who didn't make you psychotic. And they came up with this designation because in the age of parental advice distributed through mass media that really takes off with Dr. Spock and subsequent commentators, there's among some folks a tendency to try to be the perfect parent. And the perfect parent is likely to drive their child crazy. And likewise, the parent who says, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to let my kid learn the laws of physics by running out in traffic. That's a prescription for disaster as well. So came up with this idea of the good enough parent, which was a parent who didn't try for perfection and didn't try to design the ideal childhood, but also provided an environment in which trust and affection could bloom and the child could thrive. And the safe enough space, similarly, is an idea that we need places where students and faculty can explore ideas, can confront disagreement and even offensive notions that cut to the core in some cases. But at the same time, they should be spaces where people are free from intimidation and harassment and bullying. And so the idea of a safe enough space was to riff on the much maligned idea of a safe space, which gets caricatured because I think almost everybody agrees that classrooms and other campus spaces should be free of the kind of harassment that used to be endemic to college campuses. And I think almost everybody agrees that they should be places where students can learn by growing uncomfortable with ideas that they haven't yet learned to understand fully.
Yeah, so I actually have a follow-up question about that. So I agree. Presumably just about everyone agrees that campuses should be safe from physical harm. And where you get more pushback from people, or where people are more uncomfortable with the concept of safe spaces, perhaps, is when it comes to psychological and emotional harm. But I think it's probably even more complicated than that, because there are blurred lines surrounding what constitutes physical safety. So, for example, if somebody feels threatened, whether they are threatened or not, or people who report being traumatized in some way, which maybe it seems like a kind of physical harm, even though it is maybe more emotional. So when people are maybe experiencing psychological discomfort or emotional discomfort, but they're appealing to physical harm, or like reporting that they feel threatened, like they might receive physical harm, how do we draw the line there? And how do we adjudicate between disputes where one party intended no physical harm and caused no physical harm, but the other party seems to feel as though they are suffering some kind of real harm?
Yeah, I find it puzzling that people who are otherwise quite sophisticated about the mind-body issues rely on this notion of a physical versus psychological harm and talking about issues of speech and learning. I just don't understand it. I mean, the idea that somehow physical harm is more real than psychological harm, it's just ridiculous. I mean, nobody believes today, I think, that people with psychiatric illnesses or emotional illnesses don't have real illnesses and don't really suffer. I mean, the idea that somehow you don't really suffer if you have anxiety, but you really suffer if you have a sprained ankle, that's crazy. Nobody believes that. So to fall back on that because of some narrow-minded view of free speech that's a doctrinary view of free speech seems silly. I think you have to distinguish between real suffering and moderate discomfort. Well, how do you do that? That's hard. That's what teachers do all the time. That's what parents do all the time. When their child comes in and says, "Oh my God, I'm dying," and you say, "No, actually, you stubbed your toe." You have to distinguish. It's not about being physical or psychological. It's about trying to figure out how much harm we should tolerate in order to build resilience, and how much harm we should protect our charges from, because it actually prevents further development. That's a hard thing to do, but there is no formula for it. There's no formula. And if you say physical versus psychological, it doesn't give you a formula. It just gives you an excuse for not paying attention to emotional distress.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that certain kinds of psychological harm are actually worse than physical harm. The tricky thing is, how do we decide which kinds of psychological harm warrant our concern, or that we should ban certain kinds of behavior in the classroom because someone else in the classroom is experiencing a certain kind of psychological harm, and where we draw the line there.
It sometimes gets very tricky. I think most of the time it isn't that tricky, but sometimes it is, and it's those cases that get a lot of attention, rightly so, I suppose. I think it's this issue of how we determine when someone is building resilience rather than being broken down in a way that doesn't build resilience is an important decision to make as a teacher. And we make it in all kinds of ways when we're in the classroom. Most teachers today don't give grades below a B plus, let's say, and in places like Wesleyan below an A minus.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. It's true at NYU. It's even worse, I think. It's true. And I don't know where your home place is, but it just seems to be statistically the case. And I think what evolves is students who feel that they can't actually take it if they get a B minus. Well, actually, they can. They can. But as a teacher, you have to decide when it's appropriate to a student to say to the student, "This is really a stupid thing to say," because that's how you get their attention, as opposed to, "Why have you taken the point of view you have?" And those are decisions teachers have always made about how much you push someone, because by pushing them to an area where they're experiencing discomfort, they are going to learn more, as opposed to pushing them so far that they are going to turn off. Now, I do think there is something to be said. I perhaps not as generous as I might have been in the book with some of the theories about our young people today are being less resilient and they're getting coddled and that kind of stuff. I do think there are students who appeal for protection earlier than they might, but it's up to the professor then to say, "Nah, I'm sorry, not protecting this." But there's no formula for that. And I think I tell some stories in the book about classes in which you give students some sense of what they're in for, but you can actually put them in a state of extraordinary discomfort in order to have them confront real issues from which they can learn.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I really liked about the book was the sort of historical context around a lot of our modern higher ed buzzwords. So you talked about diversity and inclusion and PC culture and free speech and free inquiry, and how did we get there, and how did we come to how long have we cared about these kinds of things within higher education? And you talk about dating back at least to the late 1970s or early 1980s, thinkers worrying about the state of higher education and, balancing student comfort and free inquiry. So I've asked many academics this question before, and I haven't gotten a clear answer. So maybe you're the person to give me one. From your perspective as a historian and as an individual who's been working in higher education for a while, would you say things really are different now than they were, say, 20 or 40 years ago? Have things, like people say, things have gotten worse? Have they gotten worse? Or is maybe that not even the right way to think about it? Maybe the tension between student comfort and free inquiry is something we want. You want people pushing back against it, and you want people pushing for it. And that's really going to be the best state. And that's how higher education should proceed.
Yeah, it's hard to say, worse or better according to what criteria, right? I mean, it's not in general. I don't to say it's worse or better. It's not. I'm not sure how to make that judgment. I do think. So if one is interested in our universities, places where new ideas can be entertained and explored with rigor today more than in the past, it really would be hard for me to measure that. I think there are some ideas that are no longer explored with seriousness, and others that have gained currency, and but that statement would have been true 40 years ago.
Right.
I think that it's what has changed are that campuses are, especially at elite universities, are more diverse than they were in 40 years ago, in the sense that women have a lot more to say about how the universities are run and the content of the classes than when I was an undergraduate, which is just a few years after Wesleyan was co-ed in my case, and a lot of schools like Wesleyan in those days. So women were fairly new to those spaces, and men were used to running them as men's clubs now with women in them, and that's quite different today. I think it's good that it's quite different. I think that we have a significant percentage of students at elite institutions from low-income families, and that is different, I think, from 40, 50 years ago. But I think you have a much greater kind of inequality weighing on campuses today than you did then. So that and that leads to a different kind of politics. I think that low-income first-generation students today actually think of themselves as an identity group, which certainly wasn't the case in the 1970s. I mean, there were at least as many first-generation students, I suspect, because the previous generation didn't go to college as often. But I was a first-generation student, they say, but I never thought myself in that category. There wasn't a category like that. So I think the categorization of students into identity groups and the identity politics which follows from that is certainly stronger today. And in some ways that's really good. And in some ways it leads to different forms of parochialism. And so I think as a teacher, one's job is to break down parochialism in ways that expose people who have certain allegiances to the possibilities of having other allegiances, or seeing their previous allegiances as perhaps being unworthy of their support, and becoming more self-critical as well as critical of other groups. I do think that it's pretty well documented, and the Heterodox Academy has done a great job of doing this. That there is a narrowing of political experience among faculty members, especially at Northeast schools and especially at elite schools. And although faculty members are smart people and they're able to teach things that they don't agree with, let's say, or they don't, they're not partisans for that stuff. I do think that it takes an effort to ensure that you as a teacher and that your department and its curriculum actually exposes students to a broader range of ideas in the humanities and social sciences than the people in the department actually believe in. And I think that in many schools, that's not the case. And, I have argued that we should push back against the current narrowing of political discourse on campuses by exposing students to conservative and religious traditions that they might not be exposed to automatically, given the inclinations of the faculty. And, I have friends who think I really overstate that, people who say in philosophy who teach Aristotle and Plato all the time. Mm-hmm. and they're not exactly contemporary American progressives. And I do, and they teach Aristotle and Plato not because they are Platonists or Aristotelians necessarily, but they teach them seriously and thoughtfully. So I want to acknowledge that people can and often do teach things with which they disagree. I certainly do that myself. But I think just as was the case in the 70s and 80s when men said, well, I could teach women's history. We don't need to hire women to do that. We should just hire the best person. I think that the rhetoric of we're just hiring the best people and they happen to all agree with us politically, I think that rhetoric is really suspect. And we have to have what I've called an affirmative action program for conservative and religious and libertarian thinkers. And I still feel that pretty strongly. It's harder these days because of the idiocy of the official conservative movement in the United States. The kind of Trumpianization of the right in the United States has led to a kind of aggressive idiocy, which has no place on a college campus. And it's anti-science, it's anti-inquiry, and it just uses lying as a technique of rhetoric. And that really we shouldn't allow to become part of the campus just because it's popular in the country. We have to resist stupidity at universities. That's one of our first jobs. But that doesn't mean we should, ignore the rich tradition of serious conservative thinking and market-oriented libertarian thinking that with which one might agree or disagree, but is kind of a serious contender on some key issues, the humanities and social sciences.
Yeah. Our members in the book club noted your distaste for Trump and his supporters. I personally think the average Trump supporter is not as bad as a lot of people say, but I agree. Like there are certain things we want to take more seriously. And I think philosophy is such a great example of where academics are. It's kind of part of the field to overcome your personal beliefs. And like whether you think a particular philosopher was right or wrong, you still teach their ideas as worthy of consideration. And that's something that I'm a social psychologist. And that's something that I think we don't do. We just teach whatever we think is the right thing. And I think now more than ever, that's something we probably should be rethinking with the replication crisis and what is motivating some of these scientific findings. And maybe we should be opening up the range of what we're teaching.
Yeah, social psychology I find really interesting in that regard because it's very popular among students and lots of interesting findings, some of which are counterintuitive. But some of my friends in the field, they have a very clear political atmosphere that they create in classes, and they'll say to me, "Well, what I'm actually encouraging is compassion, let's say, or fellow feeling or generosity. Who's against that? And I get that part, but there's sometimes a missionary dimension to social psychology that is not just hygienic, it is political or values-based. And I think the field would do well to call attention to those things so the students are more aware of them and could be more self-critical. But that's each field, I think, has its own proclivities. And I think what happens in search committees and in admissions offices is that, people begin to just you get a groupthink phenomenon and you start hiring people you think are clearly the best, but they're the best from your point of view because they agree with your prejudices rather than on some independent metric. And I have had this argument at Wesleyan with some departments that really feel strongly that they should have a political profile and not just an intellectual one. And unfortunately, I don't have enough power, so I can't. I can't just make them do what I think is right, which of course makes sense. But
so you're saying they want to incorporate the politics of candidates into their decision making for hiring?
Not overtly, but let's say you have a social science department that says we're a feminist department, and but they say that's not political. That's a kind of moral stance. We don't want any. Or they say it would be equivalent to saying, well, you want us to hire some racists because,
right.
We're anti-racist. And of course, the answer is not that they should hire racists, but there may be some people working in a field who actually are not taking a stand on political issues because of the nature of their work. And, or if they did, they would take it differently than the majority of the department. And it's interesting to me because we recognize, these same folks would recognize that students today want to find faculty who look like them. That's the expression. I don't think this is a good thing, but it is a thing. It is true that many students feel that way, that they gravitate to people with whom they can identify. And if we have no one on the faculty with whom conservative or religious students can identify, then we have the different kind of replication crisis, right? We are replicating, but we're replicating people on the basis of prejudice and politics rather than on the basis of inquiry and understanding.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, but I feel like I have to get at least some of our member questions.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Oh, no, this is great. So let's see. One of our members asked, what is the systematic evidence behind the causal claim that a diverse student body enhances learning outcomes? And specifically, which forms of diversity have been shown to improve which student outcomes?
Yeah, well, I think the appeal to empirical evidence for improving student outcomes is really a fraud. I mean, there are people who do think that there is clear evidence, and the Stanford Design School has a website with tons of references about how diverse groups are more creative, that echo chambers are less likely to produce good results than groups that have lots of different points of view. And so I think there's a fair amount of social science evidence that conducted by people who want to have the conclusions that they got. However, on the other hand, I think it's commonsensical that if you're going to be graduating students into a world in which there are people from lots of different backgrounds with different points of view, you would serve those students well by having them learn with people of different backgrounds with different points of view. The other thing about diversity leading to outcomes is that I think we have a responsibility in American higher education, since we benefit from public support in the form of tax exemptions and the like. We have an obligation to promote the social mobility and not just to cement social privilege. And although places like the one I lead, Wesleyan, does we do a lot of cementing, right? I mean, we have disproportionate number of or percentage of rich people compared to the population as a whole. And so I think we have to work really hard to find strong students from a variety of backgrounds so that our students can understand people who have different experiences than themselves. Because when they graduate, we want them to live in those worlds. Now, the questioner could say, well, actually, most people, when they graduate from American universities, go into a much more segregated world than the university itself. I think that would be true. And I think that's a terrible thing for American democracy and American culture. And that the ability to listen to and learn from people with a variety of points of view is an important part of being an educated person.
Yeah, certainly it's true for a lot of students, but I wonder if the majority of students, like if you go into academia, that's not a representative world whatsoever. But for a lot of people who work, jobs that require a college degree, they might be exposed to different kinds of people. And it would be good to have some exposure to that before you're out, trying to make a living. But
I think so.
I'm not sure that it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Okay, so another member wrote, you wrote safe enough spaces before COVID-19 changed the world. How do you feel the virus has influenced your calibration of safety on college campuses? And I guess I'll add on to that in general. How do you think or hope COVID-19 will impact campus climate, both in online learning and when students finally do return to campus?
It's a really good question. I feel like it's very hard to give a good answer to that question when you're in the middle of things.
Not setting you up for failure.
It's like in 2008 and 9, people kept saying, it's this, nothing will be the same. Actually, they said that after the September 11th, and the subways would never be the same. That this would never be the same. It's all nonsense. And because in the middle of it, it feels like this is the most important thing that's ever happened to me or to my generation, and if it feels that way because it's so intense, but it's really hard to find good people who are good at predicting the aftermath. I mean, look, remember the rhetoric around disruption and the end of Kevin carried this thing recently. I saw on Twitter that the end of college was, now it's coming true. He wrote a book years ago about the end of college because of the internet and online classes and MOOCs, it was going to change everything. So I'm suspicious of such rhetoric. On the other hand, as a guy, I wrote a book called Safe Enough Spaces, and as a president of university trying to figure out whether to open in the fall, is it safe enough? Is the university going to be safe enough if there's no vaccine, or we don't know what vaccines do yet? And what is a tolerable level of risk? And I do think that as we think about opening up universities and other parts of the economy, we have to think about what's a tolerable level of risk and for whom, right? I mean, there are people who argue that it's a tolerable level of risk, and they say that because they are not yet in a high risk group. So it's tolerable for them. But if you have a 5 times higher death rate for people over 70, that's okay for them. They don't mind that. Well, I think that's wrongheaded. I think we have to think about how do we protect at a university the most vulnerable? How do we make it safe enough for older professors or staff members, while also encouraging safer practices for young people who at Wesleyan seem to think they're immortal typically. And that will make it a challenge. I really do hope that we open the university and that we go back to having a cosmopolitan environment in which international students and faculty play an important role. And I think the COVID also underscores the importance of strong federal leadership on global and national issues. So when you don't have strong federal leadership, you have real problems. And if you were in a war footing, as even like someone as pacifistic as Daniel Allen talks about, one of my heroes, she said, we should be on a war footing. What does that mean? That means that the government as a whole and the nation as a whole should be marshaling its resources to fight a common enemy. In this case, COVID-19. And in order to do that, you need science, you need epidemiology, you need sociologists, you need a lot of people thinking hard about a problem and having resources to attack it. So I think in the aftermath of COVID-19, I hope that we understand that universities are special places where advanced research gets done and people get trained to tackle real problems, and are not just bastions of elitists who are afraid of free speech. They're actually places where people are engaging in risky thinking about absolutely crucial issues in the sciences and society.
Yeah, I'm wondering, is there going to be some? It seems like a tricky position to be in, to be the person to make the decision. Like, we're going back in the fall, and I don't think you want to be the first university to make that decision, but you have to be the first to make the decision, right? If that's going to be what happens. So, who who takes the risk and makes the bold decision, and then other people follow in their footsteps?
Well, I think there will be some guidance in this regard from government authorities. And I mean, even Christine Paxson just recently, from the time we're recording this, had a piece in the New York Times about how Brown should open in the fall. But it actually says if there's testing, if we have supportive isolation, and if there's good tracing. I think that's exactly right. And Brown's not going to invent the test itself or the apps for tracing, but we need a concerted effort to put universities and other essential enterprises in a position where they can be safe enough for their faculty, staff, and students. And that probably will mean in places, larger universities, that there won't be any really big classes, and that you have to design food distribution so that there aren't large gatherings. But I think that schools will probably move not one at a time, but in groups in this way. There are a couple, like Cal State Fullerton has already announced it'll be online. Mitch Daniels at Purdue announced that he's going to be open. But when you read the fine print or the second paragraph of the story, usually they say, well, we hope to be, because nobody wants to put their student body or their faculty at an undue risk. But, it's a question of people aren't totally safe where they are right now. And so we want to make sure that we provide a safe enough environment for them to study in, and to support the kind of research that will enable societies to deal with pandemics in the future.
Great. So I actually have a bunch more questions for you, but in the interest of time, I'll give you just one more from submitted from a member. They were actually looking for recommendations for students who have been chastised for what they perceive to be as not adhering to mainstream liberal ideas. So presumably you've been involved in many student disputes. So on the end of the person causing offense to others, and on the end of the person claiming offense, what can individuals do to resolve these kinds of disputes? Like, what is an effective strategy there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that there's a general answer one can give. And in Safe Enough Spaces, I give a couple of stories of people who felt they offended by, let's say, what they perceived as racist remarks, and the person making the remarks was offended to be called a racist,
right?
Because what they thought they were doing was making another kind of point. And sometimes there's the ability to create new grounds for conversation and debate, and sometimes there isn't. So in the case of we had this free speech debate around a critique of Black Lives Matter on our campus a few years ago. And there was a lot of anger and people yelling, screaming, and that wasn't very useful. And everybody claiming free speech, the people yelling and screaming, the people said that was their free speech. The other people said that they were being yelled at because of their speech. And I think what we did, which may be a model for other things, is when Jelani Cobb wrote this piece in the New Yorker saying free speech rhetoric is often a cover for racism, I had recently published something called Black Lives Matter, so does free speech. So I felt somewhat attacked by his article, although he didn't have my thing in mind, and mine was very local. But I invited him to come and speak at Wesleyan about his point of view, which was not my point of view, because he's a really smart guy, and maybe I'm wrong, and so he was good enough to come, even though if he had seen my thing, he would say, "Oh, that's not the kind of thing I believe in, or the kind of person I would want to have dinner with." But we did have dinner, and then he gave his talk, and the students were shocked that when he got up to the podium, and very generously, he didn't have to do this. He said, "I want to thank Michael Roth for bringing me here today." And then all the activists who were in the room were like, "What? Roth? He's a fascist," and he's like, Roth and I don't agree about certain things, but it's really good to talk about it. And so there it was, these two people who don't agree, modeling disagreement, not agreement. We modeling disagreement, and then he, in a kind of ingenious way, both bucked up the activists, and I gave them support, and at the same time, steered them away from some of their automatic reactions. He wasn't supporting me in that regard. He was just being a great teacher by bringing disagreement into relation to what people already believed so that they could expand the range of ideas they would consider. And so the answer to the question is finding ways to have a conversation that expand the range of ideas that people will consider. Because some of those ideas might be true, and some of the things you believed before might be false. And I think that sometimes it's possible to do that, and sometimes it's, the conflicts are too intense or too deep, or there's no interest in finding an expanded range to consider. I mean, with some, violent ideologies and totalitarian ideologies, there is no interest in that expansion. And there's nothing to do about that but to defend yourself, I think, and the people you care about. But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, I think it's appropriate for colleges, universities, and their teachers to help students expand the range of things they would consider and expand the possibility that they would discover that they're wrong about what they believe in. Because that, it's not just getting more truths, it's also getting rid of some of the false ideas you had before. And I was very lucky in my life to have teachers who were really good at that, who could be very tough at times and gentle at other times, but making one really get rid of some of one's prejudices and open up to the possibility of new ideas.
Yeah, I love that story, and I totally agree. I wish more professors would model that kind of behavior for students and, demonstrate that they're open to listening to other people and having decent relationships with people who disagree with them. I think that's really cool.
Well, that's what I really admire about the Heterodox Academy is that I think you guys encourage that, and I mean, the fact that you invited me to be on a book club podcast when my book is actually critical of your founder, it's a good sign. And he and we don't know each other well, but I learned from him and from the other members, from John and other members of the Heterodox Society, and we don't have to agree, and that's what makes it so interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You can follow Michael on Twitter at mroth78. You can find a link to his book in the show notes. If you have any comments, you can contact me at clark@heterodoxacademy.org or on Twitter at IamHardCory. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is produced by Heterodox Academy. Find us online at heterodoxacademy.org, on Twitter at HDX Academy, and on Facebook. This podcast is for informational purposes only and doesn't represent the views of Heterodox Academy.